The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the outdoor seating area of Murphy's Bar and Grill, a popular restaurant just outside Camp Pendleton. The weekend crowd was starting to gather, a mix of civilians, off-duty military personnel, and tourists who had wandered in from the nearby beach. The atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful, with the sound of clinking glasses and casual conversation filling the air. At a corner table sat Marcus Thompson, a 24-year-old Marine who had recently returned from his second deployment in Afghanistan. His left leg, heavily bandaged and supported by a medical brace, stretched awkwardly under the table. A pair of crutches leaned against his chair, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen more than his share of combat. Despite his injuries, Marcus maintained the proud posture that had been drilled into him during basic training. Marcus had chosen this particular restaurant because it was close to the base and had outdoor seating where he could stretch his injured leg comfortably. He was waiting for his girlfriend Sarah, who was driving down from Los Angeles to spend the weekend with him. This would be their first meeting since he had been medically evacuated from Afghanistan 3 weeks earlier, and he was nervous about how she would react to seeing him in his current condition. The explosion that had changed his life happened during a routine patrol in Helmand Province. An improvised explosive device had detonated just feet from his position, sending shrapnel tearing through his left leg and causing severe damage to his knee and shin. The doctors at Walter Reed Medical Center had worked tirelessly to save his leg, and while they had been successful, the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Marcus was grateful to be alive, but the adjustment to his new reality was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. As he sat alone, sipping a glass of water and checking his phone for messages from Sarah, Marcus couldn't help but notice the looks he was receiving from other patrons. Some were sympathetic glances from fellow veterans who recognized the signs of combat injuries. Others were curious stares from civilians who seemed fascinated by his military appearance and obvious wounds. He had grown accustomed to the attention during his brief time back in the United States, though it still made him uncomfortable. At a nearby table, a group of 4 young men in their early 20s had been drinking for the better part of the afternoon. They were college students from San Diego, celebrating the end of their spring break before returning to classes. Brad, the apparent leader of the group, was a business major whose father owned several successful restaurants in the area. His companions, Tyler, Jake, and Connor, came from similar privileged backgrounds and shared his sense of entitlement and casual disregard for others. Brad had been watching Marcus for several minutes, and the alcohol had loosened his tongue and lowered his inhibitions. He leaned over to his friends and spoke in a voice that was intended to be a whisper, but carried clearly across the outdoor seating area. "Look at that guy over there," Brad said, gesturing in Marcus's direction. "Probably another one of those military guys looking for sympathy and free drinks. I bet he's going to start telling everyone about how he's a hero and how we should thank him for his service." Tyler laughed and took another swig from his beer bottle. "Yeah, I've seen that type before. They love to play up the wounded warrior thing to get attention from girls. I bet those injuries aren't even that serious. Probably hurt himself during training or something stupid like that." Jake, who was slightly more intoxicated than his friends, decided to escalate the situation. "We should go over there and call him out on it. These military types think they're so special, but most of them are just looking for handouts and special treatment. My dad says they're all just government welfare cases with uniforms." Connor, who had been relatively quiet up until this point, felt emboldened by his friend's comments. "I heard that a lot of these guys fake their injuries to get disability payments from the government. They're basically stealing from taxpayers like our parents who work real jobs and contribute to society." The comments continued to grow louder and more offensive, and other patrons began to notice the disturbance. An elderly couple at a nearby table exchanged uncomfortable glances, while a family with young children gathered their belongings and moved to a table on the other side of the restaurant. The waitstaff began to look nervous, unsure of how to handle the escalating situation. Marcus could hear every word clearly, and he felt his jaw clench with barely controlled anger. He had dealt with ignorant comments before, both during his deployments and since returning home, but the casual cruelty of these young men was particularly grating. He thought about his fellow Marines who hadn't made it home, about the friends he had lost to enemy fire and roadside bombs, and about the sacrifices that military families made every day to protect the freedoms that these privileged college students took for granted. Despite his anger, Marcus tried to maintain his composure and ignore the taunts. He had been taught that a true Marine rises above petty provocations and doesn't engage in unnecessary confrontations with civilians. He focused on his phone, pretending to read messages while his hands trembled slightly with the effort of containing his emotions. Brad, emboldened by his friend's laughter and the lack of response from Marcus, decided to take things a step further. He stood up from his table, swaying slightly from the alcohol, and walked over to where Marcus was sitting. His friends followed behind him, grinning with anticipation of the confrontation they were about to witness. "Excuse me, soldier boy," Brad said, his voice dripping with false politeness and obvious contempt. "I couldn't help but notice your little costume and your dramatic injuries there. Tell me, did you actually see any real combat, or did you just hurt yourself falling off a truck during some training exercise?" Marcus looked up slowly, his eyes meeting Brad's gaze with a steady, controlled intensity that would have warned a more perceptive person to back away. "I'm a Marine, not a soldier," he said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who had been tested under fire and had proven himself worthy of the title he bore. Tyler laughed and slapped Brad on the shoulder. "Oh, excuse us, Mr. Marine. We're so sorry we got your little military branch wrong. Does that hurt your feelings? Are you going to cry about it?" The mockery continued as more patrons began to take notice of the confrontation. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others pulled out their phones to record what they sensed might become a viral incident. The restaurant manager had been alerted to the situation and was making his way across the dining area. But the young men seemed oblivious to the growing attention they were attracting. Jake decided to join in the harassment, pointing at Marcus's injured leg with obvious disdain. "So what's the story with the leg, tough guy? Did you trip over your own feet while running away from the enemy? Or maybe you shot yourself in the foot to get out of doing any real fighting?" The cruelty of the comment hung in the air like a physical presence, and several nearby diners gasped audibly at the callousness of the accusation. Marcus felt his military training warring with his human emotions, torn between the discipline that demanded he maintain control and the righteous anger that urged him to respond to these insults with the force they deserved. Connor, not to be outdone by his friends, added his own contribution to the harassment. "I bet you're just another fake hero looking for handouts. Probably never even left the United States, let alone saw any real action." These military types are all the same. They think putting on a uniform makes them special, but they're just welfare cases with better marketing. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter as the confrontation continued, with conversations at other tables trailing off as people focused their attention on the unfolding drama. Several veterans in the crowd were beginning to look agitated, and the tension in the air was becoming palpable. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed him standing with his unit in Afghanistan, their faces dusty and tired but proud. 3 of the 8 Marines in that photograph would never return home, and 2 others had suffered injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. He looked at the picture for a moment, drawing strength from the memory of his brothers in arms before placing it carefully back in his pocket. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice still controlled, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I don't know what your problem is with me or with the military in general, but I'm just trying to have a peaceful meal while I wait for my girlfriend. I'd appreciate it if you could go back to your table and leave me alone." Brad laughed loudly and turned to address the other patrons in the restaurant. "Did you hear that, everyone? The big, tough Marine is asking us politely to leave him alone. Maybe he's not as tough as that uniform is supposed to make him look." The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and the restaurant manager finally reached their section of the dining area. He was a middle-aged man named Robert, who had served in the Navy during the First Gulf War, and he recognized the signs of a veteran dealing with harassment from civilians who had never faced the realities of military service. "Gentlemen," Robert said, addressing the group of college students with firm authority, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your table and keep your voices down. You're disturbing other customers, and your behavior is completely inappropriate." Brad turned his attention to the manager, his face flushed with alcohol and indignation. "Are you kidding me? We're paying customers here, and we have every right to express our opinions. If this guy doesn't like hearing the truth about military welfare queens, maybe he should go eat at some veterans' charity instead of a real restaurant." The comment was the final straw for several other patrons, and angry murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. An older man who had served in Vietnam stood up from his table, his face red with anger, but his wife quickly pulled him back down and whispered urgently in his ear. The tension in the restaurant was reaching a breaking point, and it seemed as though the situation might explode into violence at any moment. Marcus remained seated, his hands clenched into fists under the table, fighting every instinct that told him to respond to these insults with physical force. He thought about his training, about the oath he had taken to protect and defend the Constitution, and about the fact that he was representing not just himself, but every Marine who had ever worn the uniform. He would not dishonor their memory or their sacrifice by engaging in a brawl with ignorant civilians, no matter how much they deserved it. The confrontation had reached a critical moment, with emotions running high throughout the restaurant and the potential for violence hanging heavy in the air. Other diners watched nervously, wondering whether someone would intervene or if the situation would continue to escalate beyond anyone's ability to control it. The next few minutes would determine whether this encounter would end in tragedy or whether cooler heads would somehow prevail. Unknown to everyone in the restaurant, including Marcus himself, a table of 6 men had been quietly observing the entire confrontation from the far corner of the outdoor seating area. They had arrived shortly after the harassment began, and their trained eyes had immediately assessed the situation and identified the key players involved. These men carried themselves with a particular kind of confidence and awareness that marked them as special operations personnel, and their presence would soon shift the entire dynamic of this confrontation in ways that no one could have anticipated. The 6 men at the corner table had been enjoying a rare afternoon off from their demanding training schedule at Naval Special Warfare Command. They were Navy SEALs from Team 5, and they had decided to grab lunch at Murphy's after completing a grueling week of advanced combat training exercises. The team leader, Chief Petty Officer David Rodriguez, was a 15-year veteran with 4 deployments under his belt. His teammates included Petty Officer First Class Mike Chen, a demolitions expert with a dry sense of humor, Petty Officer Second Class James Wilson, a sniper whose calm demeanor masked a fierce, protective instinct, and 3 other operators whose combined experience represented decades of elite military service. When they had first arrived at the restaurant, the SEALs had immediately noticed Marcus sitting alone at his table. Their trained eyes had quickly identified him as a combat veteran based on his bearing, his injuries, and the subtle signs that marked him as someone who had seen action overseas. They had also spotted the group of college students and had been monitoring their increasingly loud and obnoxious behavior with growing disapproval. As the harassment of Marcus intensified, the SEALs exchanged meaningful glances across their table. They had all served alongside Marines in various theaters of operation, and they knew the caliber of courage and sacrifice that went into earning the title. The disrespect being shown to a wounded warrior was not just offensive to them personally, it was an attack on everything they had sworn to protect and defend. Chief Rodriguez set down his beer and spoke quietly to his teammates. "Gentlemen, I think it's time we had a conversation with those young men about military courtesy and respect." The other SEALs nodded in agreement, their faces taking on the hard expressions that their enemies had learned to fear in combat zones around the world. They had spent years training to operate in hostile environments, and they knew how to project an aura of controlled danger that could stop aggressive behavior without the need for physical violence. Meanwhile, the confrontation between Brad's group and Marcus was continuing to escalate. The college students, emboldened by what they perceived as Marcus's unwillingness to fight back, were becoming increasingly bold in their taunts and accusations. They had no idea that their behavior was being observed by some of the most elite warriors in the American military, or that their afternoon was about to take a very serious turn. Jake stepped closer to Marcus's table, his voice slurring slightly from the alcohol. "Come on. Fake hero, tell us about all your imaginary battles. Did you kill any bad guys, or did you spend your whole deployment hiding in some air-conditioned office while real soldiers did the actual fighting?" Connor joined in, pointing at Marcus's crutches with obvious mockery. "I bet those things are just props. You're probably going to hobble out to the parking lot and then run a marathon once you think nobody's watching. These military scam artists are all the same." Tyler pulled out his phone and started recording, grinning maliciously as he pointed the camera at Marcus. "This is going to be perfect for social media. Fake Marine gets called out for stolen valor. I bet this goes viral within an hour." The cruel laughter of the four young men echoed across the outdoor seating area, creating a stark contrast to the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the rest of the restaurant. Other patrons were looking away in embarrassment and disgust, unable to believe that anyone could be so callous toward a wounded veteran. Marcus felt his control beginning to slip, his hands trembling with the effort of containing his rage. He thought about his fellow Marines who had made the ultimate sacrifice, about the months of painful rehabilitation that lay ahead of him, and about the fact that he might never again be able to serve in the capacity he loved. The casual cruelty of these privileged young men was like salt in wounds that went far deeper than the physical injuries he was recovering from. It was at this moment that Chief Rodriguez stood up from the SEAL table, his movements smooth and purposeful. His teammates followed his lead, rising in unison with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke to years of training and combat experience together. The 6 men began to walk across the restaurant with a measured pace that was neither hurried nor threatening, but carried an unmistakable sense of authority and purpose. The first person to notice their approach was the restaurant manager Robert, whose military background allowed him to recognize the bearing and demeanor of special operations personnel. His eyes widened slightly as he realized what was about to happen, and he stepped back to give the SEALs room to operate. Chief Rodriguez reached the area where the confrontation was taking place and positioned himself directly behind Brad, close enough that the young man could feel his presence, but not so close as to appear physically threatening. His teammates spread out in a loose formation around the group, each taking a position that allowed them to observe and control the situation without appearing aggressive or confrontational. "Excuse me," Chief Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from years of leading men in life-and-death situations. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I think there might be some confusion here that needs to be cleared up." Brad spun around, his face flushed with alcohol and indignation at being interrupted. He found himself looking up at a man whose physical presence immediately commanded attention. Chief Rodriguez stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, muscular build that spoke to years of intense physical training. His eyes were steady and calm, but there was something in their depths that suggested he had seen and done things that Brad couldn't even imagine. "Who the hell are you?" Brad demanded, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "This is a private conversation, and you need to mind your own business." Chief Rodriguez smiled slightly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, When someone is disrespecting one of my fellow service members, it becomes very much my business. Let me introduce myself and my colleagues." He gestured to the men around him with a casual motion. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs. These are my teammates, all of whom have served multiple combat deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other locations where Americans like you can sleep safely at night." The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The confident sneers on the faces of the college students began to fade as they realized they were no longer dealing with a lone injured Marine, but with a group of elite special operations personnel who had materialized as if from nowhere. Mike Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of controlled steel. "We've been sitting over there listening to you gentlemen express your opinions about military service, and we thought it might be educational for you to hear from some people who have actually been there and done that." Tyler's phone, which had been recording Marcus just moments before, now hung forgotten in his hand as he stared at the circle of operators who had surrounded their group. The casual confidence that had carried him through the harassment of Marcus was evaporating rapidly as he began to comprehend the gravity of the situation he and his friends had created. James Wilson, the team's sniper, spoke next, his voice as calm and steady as if he were calling out wind directions on a rifle range. "That Marine you've been harassing is a combat veteran who was wounded in action while serving his country. The injuries you've been mocking were sustained during operations against enemy forces in Afghanistan." Connor, who had been one of the most vocal critics of Marcus, suddenly found his voice caught in his throat. He looked around at the SEALs surrounding him and realized that these were men who had earned their reputations through actions rather than words, and whose presence carried a weight of authority that he had never encountered before. Chief Rodriguez continued, his tone remaining conversational but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. "Now, we're not here to cause any trouble or to threaten anyone. We're just here to provide some education about military service and to ensure that our fellow service member receives the respect he has earned through his sacrifice." The crowd of onlookers had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Other veterans in the restaurant had moved closer, forming a loose perimeter around the confrontation, but remaining far enough back to allow the SEALs to handle the situation in their own way. Brad looked around desperately, realizing that his afternoon of casual cruelty had suddenly turned into a very serious situation. The alcohol in his system was making it difficult for him to process what was happening, but even in his intoxicated state, he could sense the danger that surrounded him and his friends. "Look," he said, his voice considerably less confident than it had been moments before. "We were just having some fun. It's not like we meant anything serious by it. Everyone's so sensitive these days." Petty Officer Chen tilted his head slightly, as if considering Brad's words carefully. "Having fun? You consider mocking a wounded veteran to be entertainment? That's an interesting perspective from someone who has never put himself at risk for anything more dangerous than a college drinking game." The other SEALs remained silent, but their presence spoke volumes. They had arranged themselves in a formation that was tactically sound while appearing casual to outside observers. Each man was positioned to observe and react to any aggressive movement while maintaining the kind of disciplined restraint that marked them as professional warriors rather than common street fighters. Marcus, meanwhile, remained seated at his table, watching the unfolding scene with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. He had been prepared to endure the harassment alone, accepting it as part of the price of serving his country. The sudden appearance of these elite operators coming to his defense without being asked was overwhelming in a way that he struggled to process. Jake, perhaps the most intoxicated of the group, made the mistake of trying to reassert his earlier bravado. "So what if you're SEALs? That doesn't give you the right to intimidate us. We have freedom of speech in this country, and we can say whatever we want to, whoever we want." The response from James Wilson was immediate and devastating in its quiet intensity. "You're absolutely right about freedom of speech. You have the constitutional right to say whatever you want. What you don't seem to understand is that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, and it certainly doesn't mean freedom from having your ignorance corrected by people who actually know what they're talking about. Chief Rodriguez stepped closer to the group of college students, his movement causing them to instinctively step back. Let me share some information with you about the Marine you've been harassing. His name is Marcus Thompson, and he's a two-tour combat veteran who was wounded by an improvised explosive device while on patrol in Helmand Province. He spent 2 months in intensive care, underwent 7 surgeries to save his leg, and is currently facing the possibility of medical retirement from a career he loves. The detailed information hit the college students like a physical blow. They had been operating under the assumption that Marcus was some kind of fraud or malingerer, and the reality of his service and sacrifice was forcing them to confront the cruelty of their own behavior. Mike Chen continued the education, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a tactical briefing. The 3 Marines who didn't make it home from that patrol were Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Lance Corporal Johnson, and Private First Class Martinez. They were aged 28, 21, and 19, respectively. They died protecting the freedoms that you gentlemen have been exercising so carelessly this afternoon. The weight of the information was crushing, and the college students found themselves unable to meet the steady gazes of the SEALs. The reality of military service and sacrifice was something they had never been forced to confront directly, and the experience was profoundly uncomfortable for them. Connor, who had earlier accused Marcus of faking his injuries for financial gain, was now pale and shaking. We didn't know. We thought, we weren't trying to—" "You weren't trying to what?" interrupted Wilson. "You weren't trying to demonstrate your complete ignorance about military service? You weren't trying to show everyone in this restaurant that you're spoiled children who have never faced any real challenges in your lives? Because if that was your goal, I'd say you succeeded admirably." The confrontation had reached a critical moment. The college students were beginning to understand the gravity of their behavior, while the SEALs maintained their position of controlled authority. The entire restaurant was watching, wondering how this encounter would resolve and what lessons would be learned from this display of military solidarity and civilian education. The silence stretched across the restaurant as the weight of the SEAL's words settled over the college students. Chief Rodriguez studied the faces of the 4 young men, reading their expressions with the same analytical precision he used to assess threats in hostile territory. What he saw there was the beginning of genuine understanding, mixed with shame and fear of the consequences of their actions. Tyler, who had been recording Marcus earlier with malicious intent, slowly lowered his phone and deleted the video he had been planning to post on social media. His hands were shaking slightly as he realized how close he had come to humiliating himself in front of millions of people online. The thought of this encounter going viral, but with him and his friends as the villains rather than Marcus as the victim, was terrifying. "Sir," Tyler said quietly, addressing Chief Rodriguez with a respect that had been completely absent from his earlier behavior. "We made a serious mistake. We didn't understand who we were talking to or what he had been through. We were wrong, and we're sorry." Brad, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, found himself struggling to form words. The casual confidence that had carried him through life as the son of a successful businessman was crumbling under the steady gaze of men who had earned their authority through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, rather than inheritance and privilege. James Wilson stepped slightly closer to Brad, his voice taking on the tone of a patient instructor delivering a crucial lesson. "The problem isn't just that you were wrong about this particular Marine. The problem is that you made assumptions about military service based on ignorance and prejudice rather than facts and experience." Mike Chen gestured toward Marcus, who remained seated but was now watching the interaction with intense interest. "Every person who wears a uniform, whether they're in the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, or Coast Guard, has volunteered to write a blank check to the United States of America, payable up to and including their life. They do this not for money or glory, but because they believe in something bigger than themselves. Chief Rodriguez moved to stand beside Marcus's table, placing a hand on the wounded Marine's shoulder in a gesture of brotherhood and solidarity. This Marine right here exemplifies everything that's good about military service. He served with honor. He was wounded in action, defending his fellow Marines and accomplishing his mission. And he's dealing with his injuries with the same courage he showed in combat. The college students were beginning to understand that they were receiving more than just a lecture about military respect. They were getting a first-hand education in values like honor, courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood that were foreign concepts in their privileged civilian world. Connor, who had earlier suggested that Marcus was stealing from taxpayers, spoke up with obvious difficulty. "What can we do to make this right? We know we can't take back what we said, but there has to be something we can do to show that we understand how wrong we were." The question hung in the air as the SEALs exchanged glances, communicating through the kind of nonverbal signals that teams develop through years of working together in high-stress situations. They had successfully diffused the situation and educated the college students. But the lesson wasn't complete yet. Marcus himself finally spoke, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "You know what you can do? You can learn from this. You can take what these men have taught you today and remember it the next time you encounter someone in uniform. You can understand that military service isn't a costume or a role-playing game. It's a calling that requires real sacrifice from real people." He paused, looking at each of the college students in turn. "And maybe, just maybe, you can take a moment to appreciate the fact that you live in a country where you have the freedom to express your opinions, even when those opinions are ignorant and hurtful. Because people like these SEALs and Marines like me are willing to fight and die to protect that freedom." The profound simplicity of Marcus's words hit the college students harder than any threat or punishment could have. They were being offered forgiveness and understanding by the very person they had spent the afternoon mocking and humiliating, and the generosity of spirit required for such grace was beyond their previous experience. Jake, who had been largely silent since the SEALs arrived, stepped forward with obvious difficulty. "Marine Thompson, sir, I want to personally apologize for everything we said. We were ignorant and cruel, and there's no excuse for our behavior. Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry for your injuries. I hope your recovery goes well." The formal apology seemed to break the dam of emotion that the other students had been holding back. One by one, they each offered their own apologies to Marcus, their words sincere and heartfelt in a way that marked a significant departure from their earlier casual cruelty. Chief Rodriguez watched the apologies with approval, recognizing that a real lesson had been learned and that these young men might actually grow from this experience. He turned to address the broader crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed here today is something that happens too often in our society. Military service members, especially those who have been wounded in combat, face ignorance and disrespect from people who have never been asked to sacrifice anything for their country." He gestured toward his fellow SEALs. "We're not asking for special treatment or hero worship. We're simply asking for basic respect for the men and women who volunteer to stand between you and those who would do you harm." Mike Chen stepped forward to address the crowd directly. "Every time you see someone in uniform, or someone who bears the visible or invisible wounds of military service, remember that they have earned your respect through their willingness to serve. They've been places and done things that most of you will never have to face, and they've done it so that you don't have to." The restaurant had become completely silent except for the voices of the SEALs, and people were listening with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for profound speeches or life-changing moments. Many in the crowd were recording on their phones, but now with the intent of preserving and sharing a powerful lesson about respect and military service. James Wilson addressed the college students one final time. "You gentlemen have been given a rare gift today. You've had the opportunity to learn from your mistakes in an environment where the consequences were educational rather than legal or physical. Not everyone who disrespects veterans gets the chance to understand their error and make amends." He paused to let his words sink in. "Take this lesson and share it with others. Help educate your friends, your family, and your classmates about what military service really means. Be advocates for veterans in your community, and never again assume that someone's service is anything less than a sacred commitment to their country." The transformation in the college students was remarkable to witness. The arrogant, entitled young men who had arrived at the restaurant that afternoon had been replaced by humbled individuals who were beginning to understand concepts like honor, sacrifice, and respect for the first time in their lives. Brad stepped forward one final time, his voice carrying a gravity that would have been impossible to imagine just an hour earlier. "Chief Rodriguez, all of you SEALs, and Marine Thompson, I want to promise you something. This experience has changed all of us, and we're going to make sure that we use what we've learned to make a positive difference. We're going to be better people because of what happened here today." Chief Rodriguez nodded with satisfaction, recognizing the sincerity in the young man's words. "That's all we can ask for. Remember that being an American citizen isn't just about enjoying rights and freedoms. It's also about understanding and appreciating the cost of those freedoms and the people who pay that cost." As the confrontation wound down, something unexpected happened. Other patrons in the restaurant began to approach Marcus's table, not to gawk or take pictures, but to simply shake his hand and thank him for his service. Veterans came forward to share brief moments of connection and understanding, while civilians approached with genuine gratitude and respect. The elderly man who had nearly gotten involved in the confrontation earlier came over with his wife to speak with Marcus. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I served in Vietnam, and I want you to know how proud I am of you and how sorry I am that you had to endure that harassment. You handled yourself with more class and dignity than those boys deserved." The restaurant manager, Robert, approached the SEALs to thank them for their intervention. "Gentlemen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you did here today. As a veteran myself, it means everything to see military personnel standing up for each other and educating civilians about what service really means." The college students remained nearby, no longer as part of a confrontation, but as observers trying to absorb everything they were learning about military culture and values. They watched as Marcus interacted with the other veterans and civilians, noting his grace and humility despite everything he had endured both in combat and during the afternoon's harassment. Chief Rodriguez gathered his team together, recognizing that their work was done. They had successfully diffused a volatile situation, educated some ignorant civilians, and demonstrated the values that the military holds sacred. Most importantly, they had shown solidarity with a wounded brother in arms who had needed their support. Before leaving, Chief Rodriguez returned to Marcus's table one final time. "Marine, it was an honor to meet you and to stand with you today. If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find us. We take care of our own, regardless of service branch." Marcus stood with difficulty, using his crutches for support, and shook hands with each of the SEALs. The emotion in his voice was unmistakable as he thanked them for their intervention. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here today. Thank you for having my back. Semper Fi." "Hoo-yah, Marine," Chief Rodriguez replied, using the Navy SEAL battle cry in a gesture of ultimate respect. Semper Fi. As the SEALs prepared to leave, the college students approached them one final time. Tyler, who had earlier been recording Marcus with malicious intent, now asked permission to take a photo with the operators. Not for social media mockery, but as a reminder of the lesson they had learned and the commitment they had made to be better people. The SEALs agreed, and the photo that resulted showed 4 humbled young men standing with 6 elite warriors, representing a moment of education and transformation that would resonate far beyond that afternoon at Murphy's Bar and Grill. As the day came to an end and the various parties went their separate ways, the impact of the confrontation and its resolution continued to ripple outward. The college students returned to their campus with a new understanding of military service and sacrifice. The SEALs returned to their training, satisfied that they had upheld the values they had sworn to defend. And Marcus was finally able to enjoy his meal in peace, surrounded by the respect and gratitude he had always deserved. The story of what happened that afternoon spread quickly through social media and word of mouth, but not in the way that Tyler had originally intended. Instead of becoming a viral video mocking a wounded veteran, it became a powerful example of military brotherhood, civilian education, and the transformative power of standing up for what's right. The lesson learned that day extended far beyond the walls of Murphy's Bar and Grill, serving as a reminder that respect is earned through action, that brotherhood transcends service branches, and that sometimes the most powerful education comes from those who have proven themselves through service and sacrifice.